to some of you guys that I make these like repeated announcements, but for new people, it's important to hear them. So a couple quick things. If you don't know how to use this whole platform and what we do in here, all you have to do is like come in, hover over the chat at the bottom, and you can click the chat and you can submit your questions to Jacqueline or just to the group. And that is your way of getting your questions answered. So very excited about that. And then a few quick announcements that I will make in here is number one, we added a feature because I know you guys don't probably want to get emails nonstop. So we added a feature where you can unsubscribe from certain lists, but still receive the webinar. But I think people are accidentally maybe unsubscribing from like all things without necessarily realizing. So we're just like trying to get everything back in order. If you find that you've been unsubscribed from something or didn't want to be, or might have unsubscribed from the wrong thing, at any point in time, we're happy to resubscribe you and get you back in so that you have the webinar emails. The way of doing that is just to email info@personaldevelopmentschool.com and we will take care of it in there. I'm always challenging people, for anybody who's new here today, to stay after the webinar if you have time. Not from a place of pressure. I'm not going to judge you if you don't. But I just think it's a really nice opportunity to connect with our community. And we have like all these really, really amazing and beautiful people in here that, I think it'll be really, really nice to connect with. And I'm really going to work hard as somebody who is blessed enough to be able to facilitate some of this hosting of a community, to just make sure going into the winter, like, I'm probably just overly concerned about everybody, but I just think again, like, some parts of the world, some countries are just probably going to go into fairly heavy lockdowns in the winter. Some parts probably won't at all. And you're kind of seeing, like, I kind of pay attention to what's going on and you see some countries moving full steam ahead in lockdown direction and some people kind of really moving away from it. But I think that unfortunately there isn't enough communication or conversation being had about like the side effects on mental health when people go into isolation and lockdown, and like just how it impacts people in general and how we need connection, and isolation can really be painful. So we're putting videos on YouTube for that. But if you guys have any requests at any point in time, resources that you need, more community events that you want, specific ideas you have, like, I really want to make sure that we have this really strong community in here for you guys going into wintertime, because I truly believe that like when we've got this disconnect or this distance physically, we can close at least a good part of that gap by limiting emotional distance. And what that means is like having people you can rely on for like vulnerability. And if you guys ever did the loneliness course, you see one of the big themes that came out of the loneliness course was quality of connection always trumps quantity of connection. And so when people feel like they have deep quality connections, they thrive with maybe just one or two really, really close people in their lives. But when we have that missing, and then we have, the distance and isolation, that can be really tough. So we close that gap through vulnerability, through having like-minded people, through creating events and things where there's a support system and a group. And so we're really just going to make sure we go out of our way to give you guys whatever we can in terms of support for this winter. And for anybody who's curious too, like when you join in here, the webinars are a part of the membership, and we've got tons of social events that are a part of the membership. We have online dating routines, study groups, just all kinds of different things. Morning and evening routines. We're going to be introducing accountability webinars going into next month with little sheets where you can go through and create your schedule for the week and what you'll work on and the goals you'll set for yourself, and then come in and share them with the group and have sort of a little accountability team to help keep each other accountable. It can be for your PDS work. It can also be just for other areas of your life in general. And we just want to make sure you have like a huge support system as much as possible in that way. So those are some initial things. I won't go through too many of the other announcements right now, just they're fairly similar. It's just that we are going to be launching our attachment styles and sex course. You'll see it out by the end of today. And then we actually launched it, but you'll see it takes a little bit to enroll all the students in it. So you may see it already. You may see it in the next couple hours. Very excited about that. And then on top of that, next month's course will be all about somatic experiencing, somatic work, nervous system regulation, a lot of these themes we've been talking about the past couple months more often, and how to really like retrain your nervous system, especially if you have a history of like kind of being stuck in sympathetic nervous system mode. If there's a lot of like fight or flight and you're always on and you're always stressed in childhood and in your upbringing, and if that's like a state that your body learned to hold on to and to stay in, how can we move the needle out of that so you can get into rest and digest mode, get into parasympathetic nervous system, and be on a path where you're healing physically as well, or your physiology is in a place that can promote healing, let's say. And then you'll see a bunch of attachment style interaction courses, a few others to come, and we're going to put a poll out right after this webinar to dive into some of those different topics that you'd like to see going into the end of this quarter. So I will answer a couple quick questions, and then today we're going to be covering a lot of codependency and enmeshment, and we're going to put a big focus today when we talk about codependency and enmeshment into like what the differences are, how they happen, like what's going on when we're codependent. And we will talk about like steps to reprogram and steps to change these things, and we'll really dig into that a little bit at the end. But I want to put a focus today on us like gauging where we're at, like how codependent we are. It is very common for insecure attachment styles to have a lot of codependent patterns, enmeshed patterns. And I want us to get a really clear understanding of what those things are, what the differences are between the two, and then what we really need to do to overcome these patterns once and for all. And you'll see we'll do a couple cool things today here that'll be sort of fun, where we'll go through talking about like what fears we have that are promoting codependency, and really gauging like what core fears we're still carrying that may contribute to codependent behaviors and patterns. And then we'll do a codependent questionnaire where you guys will be able to score yourself out of 13 in terms of how codependent you are. You may have done this before in the past. We do have the questionnaire in the course. And so what you would do in this case, if you've taken it before, is gauge your progress, right? Like, where are you at? Were you a 12 out of 13 of codependency in the past? And are you a 6 now? And those places that you scored of still carrying those codependent patterns, we're going to talk about what to do to overcome those patterns and what you'll need so that you can really dig in and hone in on those places and start empowering yourself to transform and work through those areas that may still be holding you back in this way. And we're going to really talk about as well, how we may think codependency is a good thing. We may think it's something healthy and that's benefiting our relationships, but if we really look more deeply, we can see some of the actual costs, and we'll be able to move through that together. So I just saw a little comment pop up from Jess. Hi, Jess. The codependency test is in the course in detail, with a little worksheet, but I'm going to take you guys through it live here today so we can all do the questions and score ourselves through it today together. So it is coming very soon. Okay, so first question, I will answer 2 quick questions and then we'll dive into it. First question I see here is from Isha. Hi, Isha. How are you? Nice to see you. I'm glad your question's here because I noticed you were trying to get a question in the last couple of days. So Isha says, hi, Thais. Wondering if I misprofiled my DA. His behavior is textbook DA, but he has a high need for novelty, which you mentioned doesn't tend to be the case for DAs. Some examples: he travels all the time, sometimes spontaneously and solo. We were planning to meet this weekend. I asked him yesterday if he was free, and he tells me he's flying out to Vancouver for a weekend getaway. I didn't take that personally, but it was just funny as to how random and spontaneous that was because it was so unplanned. In his career, he's a high achiever that moved quickly up into a high position and recently started his own business in a completely different field and is getting a large following and success. He's working in both jobs right now. Also, he moves around a lot. Every 6 to 18 months, he changes homes and lives in different places. Even his relationship with me has been a huge thrill for us both. Can a person be a DA and still have a high need for novelty and adventure, or maybe does he have an FA side to him? Thanks. Really great question. I think in the video I have that's about different types of DAs, we talk about there's a certain type of DA. They usually tend to be a little more social DAs as well. And they can have a need for novelty. What I would say, and one of the distinguishing features is like, I wouldn't look at like the DA through the lens of purely like, do they always value security first? What you're probably going to see, which can be quite conflicting for this person, especially the more social DAs, there can be DAs for sure that have a need for novelty and want to do new things and travel and move around. And you're going to see that they still are DA in their personality and their characteristics because they may put themselves in vulnerable places with moving, with traveling, but they won't allow themselves to be emotionally vulnerable. And that's really like the foundational part. There tends to be a correlation between somebody being DA and really valuing security and safety. And the other thing that's important to notice, sometimes you'll see that somebody can value novelty and also really value security. I've seen a lot of people over the years that get into that kind of conflicting space where they like really want to try new things and move around and put themselves out there, but they're like, they also panic if they feel like it's too much, and they can really try to get their security needs met in different forms. So we can have DAs who value novelty. It's much less rare because there's a greater correlation with them being more security oriented. Because usually in childhood, if we don't get a lot of emotional security, then what will naturally take place if we don't get attuned to, we fear abandonment, we fear being disconnected, we fear not surviving, and wherever we've got that void, we then place extra emphasis on getting that void filled to achieve that state of homeostasis or equilibrium. So it's more common, and you'll see a strong correlation there, but it's not always the case. There are exceptions. And what you're really looking for if he's DA or FA is like, is there also a time where he can be super emotionally available, very vulnerable, very open, very present? Or is he like very consistently emotionally unavailable, and maybe he's making changes and trying to become more secure and open up, but it's like the needle's moving really slowly, and that's not something that's really unfolding. So I'd really make that distinguishing between the FA and DA based on that, as opposed to, because that's the foundational part of what the difference is, right? So correlation for sure with the security piece, but not always like direct cause or direct effect. So hopefully that makes a whole lot of sense and really, really clarifies it for you. So great question, and thank you for sharing. Okay. The next question I see here is Natalie. Hi, Natalie. So Natalie says, hi, Thais. Quick update and question. The lady is leaving work next week. The relief. I also had an interview for a new position, which went really well. With my ex, I set a deadline for us deciding if he wants to work on us, and he didn't come back. So I told him I would be focusing on other things when I leave. He's since vulnerably told me that he's scared and described himself as an avoidant to anything challenging, and asked if I'm willing to wait until this weekend for a response. I'm willing to hear him out, but also willing to walk away for a fresh start. Good for you. My question is, why does the abandonment wound come up even if I'm the one leaving? Also, what happens when you have two people who have abandonment wounds? It seems like a recipe for codependency. Great question. Okay, so I'm glad the lady's leaving work. I'm sure that's probably a relief for sure. And it's nice to just be able to have that space, especially because we spend so much time at work, and like just to constantly have sort of a triggering person in your life and in your personal space, and how intertwined she is with your ex and just all those different dynamics. I'm for you to hear that. And hopefully this interview's gone really well. It's also like a really fresh start. I think part of the really challenging component of like getting over somebody when we have to see them all the time is that it's like constantly, like, it's not a very pretty analogy, but I think of like a scab being ripped off, right? It's like you're constantly like ripping off the scab every time you're seeing and interacting with that person face to face, because those feelings come back and those emotions. So hopefully you get that fresh start anyways. And you know, I think it's really good that he was able to say vulnerably, hey, I'm scared of anything challenging, or I'm avoidant to anything challenging. And I think that's a really good step that he could open up and share that. I would be willing to wait for the weekend too. Like when you see a vulnerable conversation, and the thing that I like about that, as heavy as it may be, is there's a finality to it one way or the other. Like, you know, that there's like, it's sort of like your prerequisite to real closure is like, you know, it's either going to be a hard yes or a hard no, and there's no gray area, and you're finally getting to like wipe your hands either way. I really admire that you're in a place where you're going, I'm willing to have a fresh start. Like, you know that you're okay with that, and that that's the right direction to move in. It's not this like, no, I'm willing to keep abandoning myself for this person. You know, it's like, no. If he's not on board, then I'm going to walk away as well. So I think like everything you've done up until this point is amazing. And when it comes to the abandonment wound, if you're the one leaving, it's because there's still a disconnection. There's still a loss. There's still something that is there to grieve. There's a connection that will be pulled apart or will be shifting forms, right? You may have some kind of like always caring for the person, loving the person in a way. That person can like be in your heart and your memory and can like have made an impact, but maybe it's someone who you talk to once a month over text or social media, and the relationship changes forms. And so whenever we go through that, the sense I get from your question is that maybe it's not so much the wound, and the way you can gather where you're at is it's normal to have a fear of disconnecting and a pain around disconnecting and be a little triggered. The pain will be an unmet need. The suffering will be like, I'm panicking. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not okay. I can't deal with it. And I get the sense it's more pain oriented than suffering oriented by the way you described your question. And so I think there's probably the natural pain. And to be honest, that's a healthy thing to feel. It's not something we want to stay in forever, but it's natural and normal when someone's played a big role in our life. And I imagine there's been a really big role he played in your life. I know you said he showed up and he was protective in different ways and really looked out for you and checked in. And then also he's been in your romantic life and in your work life. There's a lot of overlap. So like, it's normal to feel the pain of like, we may disconnect and that could be difficult. And so the way you're going to really fast track through the process is really get clear. What were all those specific needs he was meeting for me? And I like, the sense I got from a couple of the questions you've asked before was that there was kind of like him like looking out, like having your back, making you feel like protected, supported, that protective kind of like energy around you. And I feel like that may be something that you can really work on in the relationship to yourself. Like, how can I make sure I'm protective of myself, protective of my own needs, checked in with myself, like really strongly there. And the more you're able to like really fill those cups, of course, in those areas where he was previously filling them, it will make the transition away from that easier if that's the case. You never know too. He may come in and be like, I'm ready, I'm going to do it. And in that case, if that does come up and that's what happens at the end of the weekend, then it's going to be huge for you to be able to say, okay, great. These are the things I think we can work on. It doesn't have to be full of pressure. It doesn't have to be really stressful, but here we go. And I think the fact that you've made such leaps and bounds in the way you guys communicate with each other is like, I really would have a lot of faith that it can move in a positive direction if he's on board. And you'll know, as someone who is a DA too, they take their decisions like this very seriously. So if he comes in, it'll be all in. If he, says, no, I can't do it, then he's all out. And at least you've got that closure like we talked about. So really great question. And thank you so much for sharing. Okay, guys. So we will dive into the codependency work now. Very excited about this topic. I think we talk a lot about like reprogramming and pain points and challenges, but I really want to put a focus in like what's going on, what is codependency made of. I feel like when we can understand a concept inside out, like, and one of the things I really try to make sure we have here is, when you can go and don't get me wrong, I'm like a huge fan of therapy, go to counseling. Like I think that can work really, really well with this program as well. But what I think sometimes is if we're only doing therapy and we're not learning on our own at the same time, sometimes it's like, oh, we have to rely on someone external to do things for us, to help us, to ask us the right questions, to guide us to looking at things differently. And I feel like when we can really understand a concept inside out ourselves and really understand how our mind works inside out ourselves, absolutely therapy can help and counseling can help move the needle. And I'm in full support of that. But we can also leave a session of therapy or counseling and then also understand what we're taking away and be intentional and ask ourselves the questions we need to get to the bottom of and understand our own needs and apply these things. And so I really always think there's tremendous value. I'm not sure if we've talked about it as it relates to codependency enough. So we have some bonus content regarding this stuff today. But, I think that there's tremendous value in being able to truly understand like a concept inside out and where it comes from and what its roots are. And when we can really unpack it, we can see ourselves. We can be like, oh yeah, I have this pattern here and I have this piece here. And then that enables us to be able to know exactly what to work on and then how to do so. Obviously is something we work to provide as well. So first and foremost, when we're looking at codependency, the dictionary definition of codependency is excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a partner, typically one who requires support. But the way I like to think of codependency is it's a pattern of relationship behaviors that are essentially creating a form of addiction between two people due to subconscious fears and beliefs that we carry about ourselves and the other person. And these fears are what end up blurring the lines between self-identity and personal boundaries, resulting in unhealthy exchanges and imbalances within a relationship dynamic. So we can think of, if we're going to like unpack that, the way Dr. Gabor Mate talks about addiction and defines addiction, and I love this definition. He says addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary relief or pleasure in, but then suffers negative consequences as a result of, and yet still has difficulty giving the behavior up. right? So you see that entire cycle. It's like you yearn, you crave, you do the thing, and you get a little bit of pleasure, and then there's a huge detriment, there's downsides, there's negative consequences, and yet you keep going back. You're like locked into that cycle. And so when we apply that to the idea of codependency, like what you really see is there's this pattern of relationship behaviors where we do that. It's like you crave the connection to the person, the validation from the person, the closeness to the person, and you feel this relief or you feel this pleasure, but that person and the way the dynamic is going still has these strong negative consequences. Maybe there's a lack of trust in that relationship. Maybe that person keeps hurting you in the same way. Maybe there's this like push-pull dynamic and really painful power struggle where people really, ignite wounds and move into that space. But because both parties have these fears and beliefs about themselves and the other person, like, oh no, I'll never find anybody if I leave, or I can't survive without this person, or these different beliefs that drive that dynamic, it actually blurs the lines between self-identity and personal boundaries, right? So you see this like dynamic of not really knowing like where I am, where I end, and where you begin, and vice versa. And so you see the detriments, you see the downside of what could be a really unhealthy relationship. And generally codependent relationships become extremely unhealthy over time. And so you see all these downsides, you see all these pain points, but you have a tough time breaking free. You keep going back to that same kind of dynamic. And there feels like there's this loss of true sense of self. It's like I can become so preoccupied with the person I'm in a relationship with when it's codependent that I have a hard time even like finding my way out, knowing who I am and what my standards are and what my boundaries are and what life would look like without this person. You can't even imagine it. And so there's sort of this addictive relationship. And obviously everybody in here is familiar with the term love addiction. And when we look at codependent relationships, this is really a lot of what love addiction comes from is codependency or codependent patterns to begin with. So when we look at that, and then we look at the difference between that and enmeshment trauma, what we're looking at enmeshment trauma as is a description of a relationship between two or more people where personal boundaries are permeable and unclear. But this often happens at the emotional level where people are, and I put this in quotes, feeling each other's emotions. We're going to unpack that in a little bit. Feeling each other's emotions. And so when one person feels bad, the other person's emotions really seem to follow that. And the main difference here between codependency and enmeshment is enmeshment, we have poor emotional boundaries. We're taking on other people's emotions. We're feeling people's emotions. Codependency, we have that component, but then we behave accordingly. So we're willing to forego our boundaries. We're willing to go out of our way to prioritize the other person's needs over our own. It's the behaviors that follow. So think of enmeshment as being like our underlying sort of root or feelings. But enmeshment and enmeshed people can also take that enmeshment and actually use it to push people away instead of to bring them closer. So we may see, for example, somebody's enmeshed. They don't like that they're picking up on your emotions so much, so they close off and they try to pull away as a strategy to avoid the feelings associated with enmeshment. And a lot of enmeshment originates in families, right? It comes from roots and how we're trained or socialized or conditioned to relate to people in general, right? We pick up so many of those early patterns from the family dynamic that we're in. So when we're raised in a family dynamic where enmeshment exists, it's likely to produce that codependent relating. And this is because these are the subconscious mind's associations and rules for how we relate to others and the roles that we're playing by essentially at a subconscious level through our life. Now, something really interesting about enmeshment, and I want us to understand like enmeshment and trauma is basically anything we can't properly emotionally process. So we store it subconsciously instead, and we reorganize our nervous system and our reactions around it, right? So let's say I had a lot of fear of being abandoned in childhood, and then I have this abandonment wound. I didn't know how to work through it. I didn't know how to understand it or give context to it. So instead, I just got into a position where I held on to it and I feared it and I got into this painful place around it. So what I really want you guys to recognize is that because trauma is literally something we couldn't properly emotionally process and work through, so it just got stored and imprinted upon us, this is the traumatic imprint of enmeshment. When we are enmeshed with other people, we can't process their feelings. And so what we do is we get traumatized by that. If you see as a child and you take on, because you have poor emotional boundaries, the feelings of your mother, like I think of someone I was working with once, and he said that he was FA leaning DA, and he saw his mother growing up, and she was very depressed. And he said, like, I didn't know how to help her or save her or fix things for her. And I just knew she was depressed. I just knew, like, she was always laying in bed. She always had the lights off. She was always, like, going through a tough time. And I grew up with this really painful and profound sense of helplessness. And where does that come from? It comes from the fact that we see someone else's emotions. If we have poor emotional boundaries, we're taking that on. And then we can't properly process someone else's feelings. And so enmeshment is often its own form of trauma, and it may not be this 10 out of 10 trauma, but it can be a consistent 5 or 6 out of 10 trauma, where we have a hard time figuring out how to govern our own reality because of this painful input we're getting from someone else. And so it's important to recognize, like, if you grew up in an enmeshed family, there are natural parts of trauma that come with that. And if you find that you've got unhealthy behavioral patterns in your adult life, or find that you forego boundaries, or you people please, or whatever it might be, all of those things are usually subconscious strategies to cope with the feeling of helplessness you're trying to get rid of. So let's go back to that guy, for example. We'll use him as that example. He is coping, right? He's like, oh my gosh, taking all this stuff on. And he gets into a position where he feels helpless. And because that's a pain point for him, he learns, oh, if I people please, then someone else is happy and I don't have to really worry. I don't have to feel badly about anything. They're good and I'm not taking on their feelings. So I don't have that painful igniting of that sense of helplessness in me. And wherever we've got a lot of painful emotional associations stored, so if we've stored lots of helplessness from mom over the years, like this man, then we go out of our way to avoid pain. Our subconscious is deeply and profoundly wired to avoid pain. So if we've got this huge bucket full of painful associations around someone being in pain, we're going to go to extreme lengths to avoid seeing other people in pain because it triggers us. And that's like what I was trying to unpack when I said people feel each other's emotions. People notice each other's emotions. They personalize them at a subconscious level, and then we make them ours. And what a lot of codependent patterns are, and especially between like parent and child or within family dynamics, are I feel pain when I see you in pain. And so I just need you to be okay so it doesn't activate my pain. Because if you don't have pain, then, I don't have to deal with my feelings of helplessness. I don't have to deal with my feelings of not being able to show up and support you or fix it or solve it. And I don't have to take on all of that stuff. So a lot of, like, when we really dig into codependency and enmeshment both, what we'll find is a lot of codependency and enmeshment have to do with us still running from our own feelings, thinking that we're running from how other people feel. And when we can split that apart and really understand what to do with that, then we can actually start to make, leaps and bounds in terms of healing this stuff. So when we look at enmeshment, there's 2 categories of being raised in an enmeshed dynamic, okay, or household. There's direct and there's indirect. So direct will be family always saves family, right? It's enmeshed values within the family dynamic. So it'll be like you are conditioned to learn, and you'll hear these things, right? Like family over everything. You always show up for your family members. You do whatever you can at any cost. Maybe a lot of like guilting or shaming, like, I would have done that for you and you didn't do that for me. So a lot of these enmeshed values, and also direct enmeshment will be if parents parentify their children. So this can be things like parents telling their children all of their problems at a very young age, where like a child, like when we talk about trauma, it's that idea, right? We can't properly emotionally process. If you're learning about really big adult problems when you're 5 or 6 years old, you can't properly emotionally process it, make sense of it, understand it, not take it on. So it imprints instead, right? And that becomes its own form of enmeshment trauma. And usually parents who are installing these behavioral patterns in their kids or sort of passing them down, they first had them happen to them. right? So it's very generational this way. Like if you would have a child grow up in an enmeshed household, then when they're a parent, they're likely to also enmesh their children, not in a conscious way or premeditated way, of course, but because that's how trauma often works. It's these subconscious rules we learn for how to relate. So another version of this, and this is a really powerful one that creates enmeshment, is if we have one or more parents who actively rob the child of their boundaries. It can be overriding them. It can be like, nope, you stop crying. I don't, and really like push their like mental boundaries onto the child. This is the way it has to be. You're not entitled to your feelings. You do as I say. If you try to set a boundary, if you get punished, right, then we learn, oh my gosh, negative, I get trained to have negative emotional associations to my own boundaries, right? It's like I grow up and I think, oh my gosh, if I have a boundary, I get punished. And so I think boundaries are unsafe when that's backwards of functional, right? That becomes highly dysfunctional. Boundaries are safe. Boundaries are what keep us protected and supported. And so it's not uncommon that we can get into a space where that's taken away from us, and where we get trained essentially, for lack of a better word, conditioned, to release our boundaries, release our sense of self and identity, and prioritize others so that we can be okay in our family dynamic. So those are more direct forms of enmeshment. Indirect is like that client I was mentioning. Like he's such a great example of indirect enmeshment, where there wasn't somebody actively saying, you should take on my feelings, you should behave this way, you should release your boundaries or else. But instead he's sensing, and children are very attuned to their parents, just like they hope that parents will be attuned to them. And we're innately wired for that. But children sense their parents' helplessness or pain or addiction or fear or sadness or volatile relationships. And they actually fear their own survival when they see this. And the reason for this is, as we know, like children are, our species, our human beings are literally meant to rely on their caregivers in order to survive for quite a long period of time. Like we'll see other species of animals and they rely on their caregivers for very short periods of time. They go off on their own, when they're a month old. And there's, a difference there with human beings. It's like we need to rely on parents to protect us, to teach us, to support us for quite a long time. Children are often leaving the home at like 18, right? So we see these dynamics at play. And when there's indirect enmeshment, because we're attuned to that and we hold on to that, we fear, if my parent's not okay, I'm not going to be okay. I'm not going to survive. So I need to go out of my way in life to make sure they're okay. So I'm more likely to increase my chances of survival. And it's a very subconscious and biological thing that takes place. And it's a huge reason why when we try to set boundaries for the first time in our adult lives, if we haven't been doing it for a long time and we haven't had the tools, it's part of why it can feel so scary to start setting boundaries for the first time, because we associated in childhood boundaries as either being unsafe or something that was going to limit our chances of survival. So no wonder there's this like deep internal terror and fear of setting boundaries as an adult, right? It's like your subconscious initially wired this as being something that was going to limit your chances of making it through and being okay at all. And so we have to have a little bit of compassion and mercy on ourselves if this is something we're working on, right? And that's one example. We can also associate that boundaries will make us more likely to get abandoned, more likely to be a burden, more likely to be rejected, more likely to be shamed or in trouble, and we feel like we're bad. So we'll unpack some of those very specific associations later on. But I just want you first to understand like where this comes from, how it's working, and why it can be hard to break codependent patterns, because you've associated, I'm going to be codependent and that's going to help me survive. And that's why this can be a touchy subject at times. So as these adaptations and these coping mechanisms take place in childhood, we'll often see these behaviors follow, these manifestations follow, okay? So when we've got codependent patterns, we're focused way more on others than on ourselves, right? And we think that's a survival strategy. So what does this produce? Well, it produces a much weaker sense of self-identity, okay? Why? Because our identity is others-oriented, right? We're focused on other people's needs, other people's worth, other people's accomplishments, other people's mission and vision for their lives. And we're not looking at who am I? What do I want? How can I take my needs and myself into consideration? We'll often see an unknowing of that. You know, people, when we move down the codependent spectrum, and as people get more and more codependent, because obviously this kind of stuff exists along a continuum, people who are going to score really high on the codependent scale, we'll see them like not really look at what they want. You know, I can work with somebody who's been very codependent and they're 50 years old and they've had children and they've lived out a lot of their life. And I'm like, and what do you want from your life? And they're like, you know, never really took the time to consider. And so we can go, and that can extend all the way up through our entire lives, right? And it can be, I focused on my partner, and then I focused on my children, then I focused on this person and that person. I never even got a chance to really look at who I am and what I want. Because if in our conditioning very deep, we learned save and fix other people for us to stay safe, then we stay in that safety oriented position. And something else that's really important to correlate here is when we stay codependent, it's for that long and further along the continuum, it's often safety oriented, which means we're usually almost always in that fight or flight space. Always have to be on, always have to be people pleasing, always have to be showing up, always have to be fixing people, taking on other people's burdens. We don't get to actually move out of sympathetic nervous system and into a place where we can move up even like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and feel a sense of safety. And then we feel that baseline and foundation, and then we can move on to other parts of our lives, like self-esteem and belonging and self-actualization and all these different needs as we move up the pyramid. So, you know, we can get into this place where we just stay in like survival mode. And there's a very strong correlation between being codependent and feel like you're always surviving. So weak sense of self-identity, huge. Poor boundaries, obviously, as we've talked about, we'll see as a manifestation of this dynamic. People pleasing and low self-esteem. Why? Because if we are always focused on everything else except ourselves, how can we build any self-esteem for who we are, right? And so much of self-esteem comes from self-care and self-compassion and looking at ourselves and our own lives and finding our own purpose. It's not from like us thinking we're amazing because we constantly compliment ourselves and build ourselves up in a superficial manner. A lot of self-esteem is the byproduct of knowing ourselves, right? Getting to understand ourselves, show up for ourselves, build out a relationship to ourselves. And so obviously when that's lacking, our self-esteem is going to be compromised. And when we look at some of the dynamics here as well, sometimes we'll see codependents be in a place where they're quite reactive. Codependents generally, although they don't like to admit this to themselves, and it's okay, like everybody's got, you know, most people have some form of codependency, and some of us have been much more codependent at different times. Usually there's a need for control over other people. And it may look pretty and be packaged nicely because it might be like, yes, but I just want to control that they get better, or that they stop drinking, or that they clean up their life, or that they work hard. But like, hey, when you break it down to the baseline, you're still sitting over here trying to control that person over there and their behaviors, right? And so it may be justified and for good reasons and well-intentioned, but you're still just trying to control another person. And so we have to be honest with ourselves when we take a look at some of this stuff. We'll see a lot of like people pleasing, of course, caretaking. There tends to be an obsessive quality where there's this like leaning obsessiveness towards what everybody around you is thinking, feeling, acting, how they're behaving, these sorts of things. And we will generally see huge communication problems with codependency. Why? How can I possibly communicate effectively to anyone when I don't even know who I am, right? No matter what. And you know, I can think of times just as a person, and I had codependency stuff to work on myself. But I can think of times as a person where, you know, I needed something. Let's say, for example, I needed reassurance or transparency, or I needed to understand something from somebody in a relationship. But I only know that now looking back. I had no idea at the time. It was like this need, but because I couldn't understand what the need was, and also because I didn't feel safe believing that I was worthy of having needs. I thought I would be a burden, or I would be abandoned, or I would be annoying if I had needs. Then I can look at different times I had conversations with people in the past. And I can think of one relationship where I was in my late teens that for me at that time was a fairly serious relationship. And you know, just all I did is I had a need for reassurance or transparency. And instead of saying, hey, I feel afraid and I could use some reassurance instead, because I didn't know how to articulate that. I just felt like I needed something that somebody wasn't giving, and it felt bad and it hurt me. And I also didn't know how to express hurt and move through that. So I would just be spiteful. I would just push the person away or be moody or withdraw and see if they would react, because I didn't know how to express what I was needing, because I didn't know who I was yet. I didn't know what I needed yet. And so we see a lot of these manifestations in codependent patterns where it's like, if we don't know what we need, how could we possibly tell somebody what we need? And then if I can't talk to somebody about my needs, I'm very likely to have my needs feeling like they're unmet. And then we see this really unique thing about codependence where they go out of their way to meet someone else's needs because it gives them some sense of personal empowerment or safety or control. And then they get into this pattern where it's like, I do all these things for you and you can't do anything for me. And then we get resentful, and then we get spiteful or angry or hurt, or we build these invisible walls between ourselves and others. And so you'll see a lot of these as being these symptoms of codependency. And we can even see in extreme manifestations, feeling angry when someone else is in pain. And I see these in a lot of people who don't know how to process that, but like being in a position where they see someone else is in pain and they get triggered that that person's in pain and they want them to be out of pain because their pain is triggering your pain and your feeling of helplessness. And so you may see some of these different dynamics at play. And again, all of these are just very much related to codependency and enmeshment. And we'll see this last major theme with codependence, which is a lack of taking accountability and responsibility for my own life while expecting you to take accountability and responsibility for yours. And, we may have parts of us that take accountability and responsibility, but not like in the full spectrum of really pushing personal empowerment, pushing self-awareness, understanding who we are, and really designing our life to create what we want. So what does codependency feel like? Codependency creates feelings of stress, overwhelm, pressure. We see shame can be a big thing with codependency, because there's this constant feeling of like, I can't ever hurt anybody. There's these very heightened expectations codependents hold themselves to in their relationships. Anxiety, sadness, jealousy. We'll see a huge correlation with codependency, because jealousy is that survival response when we think we're being threatened in case we might lose somebody. Oh my gosh, if I lose you, this is going to be terrible. So jealousy really comes online to try to protect our relationship to a person and our needs. If you notice in jealousy, there tends to be a protectiveness over your territory. And what I want you to see here is when we are out of relationship to our own needs, then we put a lot of pressure and emphasis and expectation on people to meet them outside of us. And when that feels like it could be threatened or taken away, it feels like death to self, because we associate survival as being about our needs getting met. And so if I'm a codependent and I'm out of relationship to my own needs, I don't know how to meet them, but I find Bob is really good at meeting my needs, I'm going to latch onto Bob from a survival perspective. I'm going to be like, oh my gosh, Bob gets these needs met. And if there's a threat to my relationship to Bob, it can even feel like a threat to my own survival, because my needs being met are taken away. And this is where we'll get those more extreme manifestations of like anger, jealousy, hurt, rage. Those extreme feelings are often coming from, oh my gosh, my pathway to survival is being threatened. So it's also important to make that correlation, but also to like have a sense of gentleness and compassion for ourselves if we're ever going through that. Like, hey, you're feeling like your survival is threatened, and that's where that intensity of emotion is coming from. We'll also see the fear of making mistakes can be a big thing, and feeling very afraid of being alone. And this could be conscious or subconscious. Like you may see that you look at your social calendar and every single night you come home from work and you don't want to spend any time alone. So you have plans for every night of the week and weekends, and you do everything you can to not spend time with yourself, because we don't want to spend time with strangers, right? And if we're, we don't want to spend intimate time with strangers, especially if you met Bob for the first time today and Bob's like, hey, can I come home with you after work and just sit on your couch and just be with you? If you don't know Bob and you met Bob 5 minutes ago, you're going to be like, that sounds really creepy and strange. I don't want any stranger coming into my home and staring at me while I'm sitting on the couch. But if we're a stranger to ourselves, then we feel afraid of spending that time with ourselves. We sense this like natural undertone of discomfort. And so as we get into relationship with ourselves and comfortable around ourselves and start feeling safe in the relationship to ourselves and build the connection to self, well, now that fear gets to sort of absolve and we move away from it. So we'll see that tends to be a big dynamic. And we will also see that we can look at different dynamics in terms of like codependency along a continuum. And we can see that on a continuum at a small level, somebody can be codependent just because they never express their own feelings and needs to a partner. That is a form of codependency, right? It's like more passive codependency. And it's like, oh, you're there for someone else and you try to discover their needs, but you never insert or express your own. And wherever we don't share our needs consciously and intentionally, our subconscious mind, and we will not escape this, is a needs meeting machine. So wherever we're not consciously and intentionally sharing our needs, it's a matter of time before our subconscious mind is finding indirect strategies to meet our needs, which often look like manipulation, coercion, guilting, shaming. And it doesn't mean we're a bad person. It doesn't mean that, oh, you're going to manipulate somebody to get your needs met. It means that this is biologically how you're wired. Your subconscious mind is that needs meeting machine. And if we don't have a healthy way of getting our needs met by understanding them, articulating them, then we're going to be in a position where we make someone jealous to see if they care about us. And that meets our need for reassurance. Or we guilt trip somebody about how they didn't meet our needs and we make them feel badly. And that's a way of getting our needs met next time. And this isn't that we're like this horrible, unhealthy person. It's that we don't have proper ways of communicating. We don't have proper ways of actually healthily identifying the need, talking about it, being approach oriented towards it. And so we're more likely to fall into these unhealthy subconscious patterns. So we'll see that sort of in these passive codependent ways, or more active codependent ways, or when we actually get into like controlling someone, we get into punishing them, getting angry at them, really pressuring them, putting so much more focus on like their life than our life. And we have this really strong picture of how their life should look, but we haven't really taken that time to look at our own and how we want to show up and how we could behave. So I want us to take a look for a moment here. And hopefully this all makes a lot of sense so far. And you see the different codependent patterns that you may have been carrying. And what I want us to look at here now for a moment is the underlying beliefs and fears that tend to create codependency. Because once we can articulate the root cause of something and work on that, the symptoms can start to fall away. And what I want you to see here is that we first have to have beliefs working against us to even become codependent, right? Like if I believe as a person, I am safe on my own. It is safe to be alone. I can be happy on my own. I am worthy of communicating my needs to others and having healthy relationships with others as well. I can be my own source of love and approval, but I'm also deserving of love and approval. If I have all these good beliefs working for me, I'm very unlikely to have codependent behaviors. And what we know when we talk about the concept of like BTEA, we know that our belief and thought patterns create those emotional responses. And then we know that those emotions produce those actions. And so if we don't have painful beliefs that make us feel scared or afraid or bad, we're not going to have actions that follow that lean us towards codependency, right? And when we look at the underlying beliefs, here are some major ones. So number one, and you can take a moment here actually, and we're going to do the codependency questionnaire after this. So this is sort of a time for like you guys, even if you want to share some of these things in the chat or things you notice come up for you, we can take a look and see like which of these beliefs really resonate with you. And whichever stands out to you in the ones I'm going to share with you, those are the beliefs you end up wanting to work on, okay? So number one, we're going to go through 8 different ones, but some of them have like multiple components. Number one is I am bad or I am hurting people if I make a mistake in a relationship and someone's feelings are hurt. Okay, so there's a sense of like internal shaming of the self when things are less than perfect, right, in our relationships. And it's not like a healthy reframe of that would be something like, sometimes relationships, we're going to accidentally hurt each other's feelings. We're going to make a mistake or do the wrong thing. And I trust that we can work through it and communicate about it, right? But there's this inherent In this belief, this idea that I'm a bad person or I'm responsible, I'm the one hurting them if I make a mistake and someone's feelings are hurt. It's not, oh, there was a miscommunication or we have separate needs or there's this objectivity to it. It's me. I'm the bad guy if I do anything wrong, right? So you hear that like inherent and profound responsibility the codependent puts on themselves in a relationship. Belief number 2, and we can't be codependent for too long without this belief, I am responsible for how other people feel. Okay, so we can take a look at that one. And how do we act? Like, try to imagine here for a moment, when you have this belief that you're responsible for how other people feel, how do you feel? Like, what emotions come with that belief? And you're going to find a sense of like pressure, a sense of overwhelm, a sense of like, just a lot of expectation in your relationships. And then how do you behave when you think you're responsible for how other people feel, when you truly believe that you are the only one responsible for everyone's feelings around you? How do you show up? And you'll usually find that, oh, I people please. I over worry about everybody else and under pay attention to myself. And I get very preoccupied with my external relationships. So try to really look at like that belief as a whole and the behavioral manifestations that take place as a result of it. So that's number 2. Number 3, I have to be perfect in order to gain others' love and respect. Okay. So you hear in there's this sense of like, I have to go above and beyond to earn my worth, right? To be lovable, right? And mistakes take away from my worth, as opposed to my worth being something inherent and me naturally being worthy of love. And I'm not in a position where I have to show up and keep accumulating it from my interactions. And codependents tend to have that concept or idea that like every interaction it's like an exchange. Like I think of like a game. Like if you ever played like little video games when you were a kid and like you collect coins, like I think of this idea of you like every interaction, you're like collecting coins from somebody and then it shows your worth at the end. Like that's not how it works. And to be clear, and I always think of this concept, and maybe it'll sort of stick with you guys too, but I think of children and how, for a child to feel worthy of love naturally, one of the healthiest and best ways of giving this to a child is for a child to literally just be given love by their caregivers when they're not doing anything, right? Like the child's watching television and you go up and you like give them a hug and like, hey, you're amazing. I love you. I'm so glad that I have you, whatever it is, like any kind of like really healthy reinforcement. That's not when the child just got a good grade. That's not when the child just, did something impressive or outstanding, and so there isn't this association being built that it's you're worthy and you get love and appreciation and connection and your existence is valued just because you're here, just because you exist, versus that belief that tends to be formed when you get that love and connection when you did, right? When you collected the coins. So anyways, so this idea that I have to keep gaining love and respect, I have to be perfect to gain that love and respect. My errors are misgivings against me and take my coins away, right? Number 4, other people's problems are mine to solve or repair. And when I can't, it's my fault. Okay, we'll see that as a big one for codependency. I'm not going to explain that because it's pretty self-explanatory. I need love and approval from others in order to be safe. Okay, so if I'm not getting approval or some kind of external love, I become unsafe. Number 6, guilting and shaming myself keeps me good and thus safe. Okay. How often do we see that one? There is it's very easy to fall into that trap. It's very easy to think, oh, sorry, I just came in the view here of seeing all you guys. I go back and forth and I just saw Unicorn Avoider is your name today. The unicorn jockey, the unicorn avoider. It made me laugh. But we have this idea, right? And we get into like, I have to guilt or shame myself to keep myself good. that's just the result of some kind of concept we picked up as a byproduct of classical conditioning. That I know I say this all the time, but it can't be further from the truth. Guilting and shaming ourselves just keeps us in this belief pattern of I am bad, I am unworthy, I am undeserving. And all we're doing is we're keeping that subconscious comfort zone alive where we don't think we're worthy of having what we want. We don't think we're deserving of having what we want. And when we make a mistake, the first thing we should do is we should figure it out. What is the root cause? What led up to me making the mistake? What was going on prior to me making the mistake? What was I afraid of that led me to make that mistake? What was my huge unmet need that led me to make the mistake? We should inquire, not guilt and shame. When we guilt and shame, we distract ourselves from getting to the bottom of things. And when we then inquire, we should have compassion for the fact that, hey, I was really afraid when I messed up. I was panicked. I was wounded. I had a trauma that showed up for me. And then we can take accountability properly at the root level. We can say, okay, now I know in order to prevent this mistake from happening, I have to work on that underlying fear that sponsored that action. And now we can get into a really healthy position for ourselves. But instead, when we just guilt and shame ourselves, we do nothing productive, right? So we keep ourselves not in a position where we feel good or worthy and deserving, and we maintain that subconscious comfort zone. I am bad, so I shouldn't get what I want. And so I feel bad, and then I take on more responsibility for people's lives over my own. So that's a huge one. Number 7, my sense of self is directly connected to the relationships around me, who I'm in a relationship with, who likes me, who's giving me approval, how many relationships I have, the state of my relationship. A huge thing I see about codependence, and it's like massive and it's so important to be aware of, is the moment there's a problem in their relationship. So let's say, for example, like you have a 9-to-5 job and you work at a corporation. The moment there's a problem in your relationship that day, you had a fight in the morning on the way to work. It's as if like your sense of self is being harmed for the day. It's not like this objective feeling of, and honestly, personally, I've been on both sides, so I can explain on both sides of it. I remember being a late teenager and definitely being very codependent and getting into a fight with my partner at the time and going into work and just feeling like I can't even be here. Like I can't even work. Like this is so hard. This fight is hurting me so much. Like feeling like the sky was falling. And, now if something like that were to happen, it would be like, okay, this is an argument and we'll resolve it. We'll get to the bottom of it. And having a sense of like, that's not my entire identity that's being, broken into 1,000 pieces. It's a sense of like, okay, I'm going to go be present at work. I'll work to resolve this as soon as I can. And this trust and faith that this will get better. And we trust each other to communicate through things. And so you can see like the heaviness of one and the intensity of one where it feels like life isn't okay if your relationship isn't okay. And huge sign of codependency. Number 8, core fears of being, and these are core wounds, abandoned, alone, unsafe, unworthy, unloved, powerless, helpless, unseen, not enough, and unheard. Okay, those are major core wounds connected to codependency. There's a lot. And you can see them in all the different ways. Obviously, the abandonment, the fear of being alone, believing you're not worthy and you have to keep earning your worth, unsafe if someone pulls away from me, I can't survive on my own, I don't have my own way of meeting my needs, I'm not loved. And then the powerlessness and helplessness literally get reinforced by us being faced with the real and true realization that even if we'd like to control someone else's life and make them better or fix their problems or change and heal all their feelings, that's just not how it works. We can be supportive. We can meet someone's needs if they ask and if it's fair for us and we consider ourselves. But ultimately, we can't wave a magic wand and fix everybody's life for them. And it's not a productive way of putting responsibility on ourselves. And so, we're going to keep feeling a sense of helplessness and powerlessness in our relationships as long as we're carrying codependent expectations of ourselves, because as much as we would like to, it's not really always going to be possible to. So really important for that as well. Okay. So what do we need to stop codependency? These are not our reprogramming tools, or these are not our transition tools yet. These are core themes that we can focus on. And what you can do from here is just notice where you're struggling. This isn't our codependent questionnaire yet. It's right after this. And we can give ourselves a score. But this is just us looking at what's important, themes that we have to pay attention to and work on in our lives. to move beyond some of those core patterns that we just mentioned. So number one is we need to learn to value individual feelings, needs, and opinions. We'll often see, with codependency, this dynamic of like, if you and I don't agree and we're not on the same page, the sky is falling. We'll see a lot of like codependents not being able to be okay with someone having a different belief than them, a different opinion. We have to be aligned all the time. We have to be enmeshed and together all the time on everything. And it is that much more painful when we're like, oh my gosh, someone feels differently than I feel, versus like, it's healthy to value individuality, right? Not exclusively. We don't all have to be completely different, but healthy interdependence means making room for both, making room for a place where we can say, hey, independence is important. I value individuality. And we can also have alignment and similarities and shared ideas and opinions and components. And both are good and both are right. It's not a mutually exclusive thing, and it never will be. So we really want to look at that dynamic first. And valuing individual feelings, needs, and opinions includes learning to value our own feelings, needs, and opinions. Okay. Number two, individuals who want to work through codependency have to work on this theme that we've talked about of taking charge of their lives and releasing control of other people as a means to feel safe and empowered. Empowerment, healthy empowerment, and let's look at the distinction here. Power, unhealthy, right? Oh, I'm going to have power over other people. I'm going to have power over people in the world or whatever, we think of those like movies of people who are trying to take over the world or whatever, like Pinky and the Brain. But we think of like these dynamics, and like, that's unhealthy. This is this like belief that I build myself up and build my sense of self-esteem up from control over other people, power over other people. Healthy empowerment is power over my own life, power over my actions, my behaviors, my thinking, my boundaries, my needs, a mission and vision for my life. That's healthy. And so making that distinction and being able to have a healthy distinction there of, hey, when am I in a place where I'm trying to seek power over others instead of power over myself? Another big thing, changing and reprogramming our beliefs is a big part of ending codependency. Of course, that targets the root level specifically, as well as having a healthy relationship to our own needs that we're trying to get met through other people. Those are our two main root causes, right? If I'm codependent, I know that I am hyper relying on other people to be the source of filling my needs buckets. And that usually represents a sense of learned helplessness in the relationship to myself to fill my own needs buckets. So, really simple and powerful exercise. Sit down, write out all the needs you're trying to get met through other people through codependent behaviors, and then actually create strategies to deeply and consistently work on meeting those needs in the relationship to yourself until your subconscious mind actually builds some self-trust around your ability to meet your own needs, and through the repetition and you showing up consistently over time actually feels like it feels good for you to be the source of your own needs being met. Another really important component is being able to increase our self-esteem through enforcing our self-identity. And what does it mean, enforcing our self-identity? It means being able to not only know who I am, but to allow myself to take up space in the world. Okay, so it's one thing for me to do all the personal inner work and know who I am. It's another thing for me to say, hey, you're forcing your opinion on me. I actually don't want your opinion. Thank you so much though, or whatever it may look like, right? Or to take in someone's opinion and be like, hey, I really appreciate that you want to communicate about that. I just disagree, or for us to say, hey, a boundary's been violated. That doesn't feel good. I think what we'll often see is there's a transitionary period where, and I'll just, again, share, because I've been quite codependent in the past. There's a transition period where for me, I did a ton of inner work and got really clear on who I am and what I wanted and what my needs were and all these different things. And then that's not enough. Unfortunately, it would be really nice if that was the end game. But then it also becomes taking that out into the world and being able to state your needs and tell people your needs and see them through and enforce your boundaries and speak up and be consistent at speaking up when a boundary is violated and being able to say, hey, and it doesn't have to be in a way that breaks down your relationships and ruins your friendships. It can be in a very polite and caring manner. It can be, hey, I know where you're coming from when you talk about this with me right now, is like you're trying to be supportive and helpful, and I appreciate that. For me, this is a really hard boundary right now, and I hope you can understand that too. You know, we can have very eloquent conversations with how we communicate our sense of self to people, and when we feel like our boundaries may be violated. And this is, again, like this massive part of moving beyond codependent patterns. Another big piece is to know where you end and someone else begins. This is a massive concept, and there's sort of two parts to it. And I think this is one of the most important concepts, like I would say top 10 in terms of healing in general, especially if you've ever been FA or AP. And mesh GAs as well. But it's understanding the difference between like big codependents overfeel for others and underfeel for themselves. So it's easy to like get into a space where you're like, but Bob is probably hurting, you know, Bob, and I'll give you a really clear example of this from a client. I had this client once, and like she was so sweet, like so sweet, had been through so much stuff. She was very FA with a very strong AP side, and like really wanted to heal. She was very young too. You know, she was like early 20s in her healing process, which is just like, I think is amazing to see, of course. And her boyfriend was not treating her well, was being mean, was being harsh, was being cruel, was not giving, you know, no like violence or anything like that, but just very like dismissive, mean, harsh with words, nothing really coming out positive on the other side. They were in this power struggle stage of the relationship. She was like trying to heal and work on herself and put in all this work, and she just kept getting like shut down, pushed away, mean things. And she would say like, oh, you know, we got into this argument, and she'd be like, but I know he's hurting. I know him, and I know what he's been through. And he just said all this stuff to me, but I know it's because he's in pain. And I just want to like reach out to him and make sure he's okay. Now, when we break that down, it's beautiful in one sense, right? It's so kind, it's thoughtful. It's like, you know, like you can see through the facade, right? We can see beyond, you know, the surface behaviors, and understand human beings when they are coming from that place, are operating from a place of pain. And the other beautiful part of that is it depersonalizes it. It's not, oh, it's because I'm unlovable or because I'm not good enough. It's, no, that person's in pain. But where this becomes highly problematic is when we are seeing only that person to the expense, or at the expense of ourselves, right? To the exclusion of ourselves. And it's like, hold on a minute, like hard stop. Like, yes, he's in pain. What about you? Have you looked at yourself? Have you looked at your feelings? Have you looked at how you're feeling in the situation, how you're being treated? And we have to learn to consider those things equally. Okay. Codependency does not mean hyper independence or counter dependency. It doesn't mean that we get into a place where we're like, let's shut out everyone else's feelings around us and only become focused on ourselves. It's about moving the needle to balance. It's about moving the needle to a midpoint. And it's about being able to say, I see that he's in pain. I understand that he's in pain. And also his behavior hurt me as well. And what do I need in a situation to feel better? What do I need not to on my own as in this moment as a person? You know, what do I need to lick my wounds to feel better and to feel a sense of comfort or relief in the situation, and being able to really tend to that. And so, you know, that's really, there can be this like very beautiful part in a way of codependency, to like see into others in a really nice way. But it actually becomes really dysfunctional when we do that to the exclusion of ourselves. It's like we obliterate our sense of self. And I think of as an analogy, because we have to remember like what happens inside of us in the relationship to self, it can be very useful to externalize that and imagine that that's happening from the outside in. Imagine and talk to dad. I don't, why would I put myself in that position? And so we do that in relationship to ourselves when we get into these patterns, right? It's like we say, oh, my feelings don't matter. Who cares about me? Just focus on making the other person feel better. That's not right. And it's only going to lead to resentment long-term in relationships, which is, again, really strong symptom of codependency. And the other part of this is the other prong of this in a way is your needs. Same thing applies. It's not just the emotions, it's also the needs. Are you overvaluing other people's needs, not taking your own needs into consideration? Really, really important to stay on top of. Okay. So what we are going to do now that you have this deep understanding of codependency, hopefully, is we are going to go through a little questionnaire to gauge your codependency score out of 13. So what you're going to do, and you can turn it into a percentage at the end if you'd like to, by obviously dividing one number by the other. But we're going to go through and see where you show up. And I can go through this slowly, but please keep in mind, if you go into the workbook in the Codependency and Enmeshment course, this is actually in there. We put a lot of other bonus stuff in here today, but this is like going to be in lockstep with the actual questionnaire in there. So you can always go in and print that off if you don't. I just can imagine some of you guys like try to write everything down really quickly. If you're like, oh, that one was me, let me write it down. Just know that you have that as a resource. You can go back and circle. So don't feel stressed or pressured. So what I want you to do is I'm going to read through the 13. I'll pause in between and just notice if this shows up for you. If it shows up strongly, give it a full point. If it shows up not very strongly, give it a half. If you're like, oh yeah, that's definitely me a little bit, but not fully, give it a half point. It may have been you and you've done a lot of work and you're only a half point where you used to be a full point. And then at the end, add up out of 13 what you scored and try to keep track of, and you can just write the question number if you'd like. Try to keep track of where you have to do the work. Okay. So which ones really stood out to you and how is this a place where you might want to do the work? Okay. So number one, do you say, and do you find yourself in this pattern quite often of saying yes to others when you want to say no? Okay. And this may be that you realize after. It may be like you walked away from the situation. You're like, wait, I said I would do that thing on Friday. And like, I actually really don't want to do that. Why do I have to do this now? I see a lot of those dynamics coming out of clients historically, or like, I just said I would help them with all of their work over the weekend. And why did I do that to myself? I actually didn't want to do that at all. So try to look. Do you say yes to others when you want to say no? And you can give yourself a score there. Number two, do you find yourself being easily triggered by other people setting a boundary with you? Why is this? Because if you think you're boundaryless, your subconscious mind tends to project from its own perception. So you are very likely to assume that everyone should be boundaryless. And you may associate someone setting a boundary with them, like pulling away, abandoning, not liking you, rejecting you, thinking you're not good enough, all those core fears that tend to drive the codependency. Number three, do you get upset or extremely bothered when someone else is upset with you? Okay. And I don't mean like you feel like, oh, I don't like when someone's upset with me. Of course, it's never going to be a good feeling for anybody. But do you feel like, oh my gosh, I have to fix it immediately, I can't deal with it? Or are you able to say like, that wasn't a good situation and I'll definitely work to resolve that later today? Are you able to like set it to rest, or do you become highly preoccupied, extremely bothered, right? Number four, do you crave approval or praise in order to feel like you have a sense of self-esteem? Okay. Do you find yourself like yearning for that? Like, I need the approval or praise from my partner to feel like I matter to that person at all. Okay. And finding that your connection there seems to be sort of dependent on that. Am I going too fast? Are you guys okay if I keep going? Yeah. Okay, good. Next one, do you lose yourself in relationships? Or do you find yourself, and this is sort of on the other end, but there's an enmeshment feature there, very afraid of being swallowed whole? Okay, so let me articulate this in detail for a moment. What I will often see with codependent patterns is you can be like, oh my gosh, what if I lose myself in a relationship? Or not even afraid of losing, you can just lose yourself in relationships, feeling like when you get into a relationship, your sense of self sort of falls away. But we'll also see like mostly fearful avoidance, sometimes afraid to get into a relationship because there is a subconscious knowing that it's, and fearful avoidance to be very like this. They tend to feel like, I can have myself or I can have you. And they're mutually exclusive things. I can't have myself and my sense of self and a healthy relationship at the same time. The moment I get into a relationship, it becomes all about the other person and my life sort of falls apart. And, to be honest, we'll even see this with fearful avoidance, like with hobbies, with work, with like different places where they'll really just immerse themselves in something so much to the expense or to the exclusion of their sense of self. So try to see if that shows up for you. Do you suppress your emotions or pretend to others you're okay when you aren't? Okay, I find a lot of yourself like, oh no, I'm fine, it's fine. And maybe you're like, no, I don't want to share because I don't want to be a burden to anybody. I don't want to share because I don't want people to think I'm weak. I don't want people to judge me or maybe reject me and then abandon me, right? So feeling like you have to keep your mask on, or else, right? My impending fears can come up that are related to codependency. Next one, do you avoid speaking up in order to avoid conflict? An extension of that could also be, do you hyper speak up eventually because you've been holding things in for so long and trying to avoid conflict and pretend like everything's fine that you get to a boiling point and now it's like the conflict isn't just about today in this moment. The conflict is about today and also what you did on Tuesday and also what you did last Friday and also what you did 3 months before that I never told you about, that I've been angry about this whole time. And also last year, do you find yourself in that position where it's like all these things are coming up at the same time because you were just like, nope, I'm not going to say anything, not going to say anything, not going to say anything. And then you just can't possibly hold it in any longer. So that can be a big one. And the reality is like to exit that, your exit strategy from that pattern is to learn to actually like be attuned to yourself in real time and to know yourself and know your needs and understand your feelings. And the moment something goes wrong, even if it's small, you can be like, hey, a moment ago, you probably didn't mean anything by it, but that comment, like I took that comment the wrong way. It kind of hurt me. Like, what did you mean by that? And just being able to like insert yourself and allow yourself to exist and take up space in real time. So you don't get to the point where you've been holding on to that thing from 5 weeks ago or 5 months ago, or even 5 years ago. So really, really important. The next one, do you believe mistakes equals failures? And do you find yourself putting excessive pressure on yourself, especially when it comes to mistakes in relationships? I've seen a lot of codependents over the years, like be in a position where the partner of the codependent is like, well, my partner always does everything perfectly. They don't have any problems or flaws. And it can be because that person's so like hyper vigilant and focused and intense about always doing everything so perfectly. That's not how we're supposed to be. Relationships sometimes are going to be messy, and relationships sometimes we're going to totally make a mistake. No matter how evolved we are, no matter how far we've come in our personal growth journey, we're humans. So that's how it works. And when we are like micromanaging everything all the time, that's usually a symptom of like excessive pressure, us sort of abandoning ourselves to try to be perfect for the relationship. And that's not actually something too healthy when it really comes down to it. Our next one, do you blame others at times to avoid your own feelings of shame because you're too afraid of mistakes? So sometimes we'll see codependents try to hide their mistakes as well, like really go out of their way to not take accountability, to project, to make it the other person's fault, or to say, I wouldn't have made the mistake if you just did this, this, and this. And sometimes it's like so much shame and so much fear of feeling that shame that a codependent may often find themselves in a situation where they deflect, lie, fudge the truth, avoid things altogether or blame. Do a lot of this like, no, I can't take accountability for the mistake because if I do, I'm going to be abandoned forever. I'm such a bad person, and that just, if we have any of that pattern in our life whatsoever, you can bet that is a huge, huge obstacle to growth, right? There is immense healing and immense opportunity for growth when we're able to say, you know what? I think I did mess that up. I see that for sure. Okay, here's what I can do next time. And so it's a really important part of taking responsibility for our lives and see the main theme there. I take responsibility for my life, right? I'm paying attention to me. It's not about my impact on everybody else all the time. I can actually give attention to myself, nurturing, healing, responsibility for my identity instead of always everyone else's. Next one, do you excessively compare yourself to others? And why would this be a codependency thing? Because it's your way of deriving your identity and who you are and what you're like from the outside in, right? So huge overlap and correlation there with being codependent. And if you're finding that you're constantly finding yourself through other people externally, there's probably an absence of finding yourself through the relationship to yourself, through self-awareness, through deeper questions, through, really like looking into yourself, understanding your needs, etc. Next one, we have 3 more, and then you guys can share your score in the chat if you would like. Do you have to feel needed to feel important or alive? Do you feel like you have to stand out to feel like you matter at all? And this is a huge codependent feature. Often codependents are drawn to people in pain, partially because it's usually a subconscious comfort zone from childhood, but also partially because if I can help you and fix you and save you, I can get my sense of significance from doing that, right? Big codependent piece in there that can arise. So really important to pay attention to that. And then there's this dynamic in there too, a lot of the time where it's like, you feel like you have to be above and beyond and stand out in some way just to feel like you're worthy of love at all. It goes back to the coins thing, right? It's like you're constantly trying to collect your tokens to feel like you matter. Do you feel resentment towards others because you are repressing your needs? Okay. When I hear historically, like when a client would come into my office and be like, oh, I have so much resentment towards my partner, right away, my brain's like, you're probably not communicating your needs. Is this person codependent? What questions can I ask to kind of get to the bottom of that? Like, I'm like looking for other codependent signs quite quickly, not because one always means the other, but because there's a very strong established connection between the two. And we tend to be resentful when our needs aren't met and we're not communicating them and asserting them and sharing them. If we are doing that, we're consistent about sharing and communicating and letting our needs be known and all these different things, what you're generally going to see is we're good at that. And that means that we have a higher level of self-esteem that's going to come with that, because we have to be in a good relationship to our own needs in order to be able to do that and feel good about doing that. And then what happens is if we're in a relationship with somebody and we're showing up for ourselves and we're healthy and we're sharing our needs and seeing them through, and then we're with someone who's just brushing them off all the time and doesn't want to meet them, we're also going to have the self-esteem to leave the relationships like that and be like, you know what? I can respect this person. I can care about this person, but I can also recognize this isn't a healthy situation for me as a person. And with that being said, I'm probably going to have to change the dynamic of this relationship. So when people are very resentful for very long periods of time, it's usually, okay, there's probably a needs issue that's related and connected in there. And last but not least, do you find that your sense of self is based on what other people are thinking about you or feeling about you in your life? Okay, so that's pretty self-explanatory, and I'm sure it's pretty clear as to why. So out of 13, please take a moment to share your score. And so far, as we're at this place, what was the last question? I just saw someone type. The last question is, are other people a major part of the way you feel about yourself, or what other people are thinking about you or feeling about you, a major source of your self-esteem and self-identity? So it's like, are you always thinking like, oh, how my partner feels about me is making up my sense of self-esteem for the day, and what people think of me in the workplace is making up my sense of self-esteem for the day? Is that seriously what's driving that? And then I see a lot of these scores in here. Thank you guys for sharing. Not too bad. I don't see too many really high ones. A lot of like middle of the road, 9.5, 11.5, 11 and a half, 8, 9. So the higher your score, the more there is to love about yourself, right? And I mean like to love in yourself, to love yourself through. And when you're in this position and you're like, okay, there's lots of this, it's beautiful. It's like, okay, then there's a lot of me that needs to be, and it sounds cheesy, but it's like you probably in reality adopted these patterns as a kid who felt really afraid and unsafe in their environment and didn't really have a better way. And so you've got these dynamics and you're probably like, oh my gosh, I have all these pain points in these dynamics. And there's a little part of you in there that's afraid and that doesn't know a better way and that hasn't learned to protect yourself and show up for yourself. And so if you see a high score, try to look at it that way. Like, hey, there's parts of me that were once really afraid and probably had to deal with things way too big for me as a child. And this is my opportunity to give those parts of myself love and healing and compassion and support. And to do that consistently enough to the point where like, I don't have to feel or live like that any longer. And I want to really highlight here, like, a lot of people who are really codependent, there's a lot of fear in there because there's a really strong dynamic of thinking like, oh my gosh, I don't understand like how to live without this person or how to live without, if something goes wrong with this person. And a lot of like deriving your sense of self from the outside in is a lot of like deriving your sense of self from things we can't actually control, no matter how much we'd like to. And it's a really scary way to live, right? We're always going to feel like on guard and overwhelmed and afraid. And so we really have to go back in there and like nurture ourselves through that and give ourselves kindness and support. And as we do that, we're going to feel a lot safer in our own world. It's very easy when we feel like we have no boundaries and we're trying to control things we really can't. It's really easy to feel unprotected and unsafe in our world. And imagine too, like if I'm boundaryless, like anybody can do with me whatever they want. They can say, work at this job, say these things to that person, behave this way. And if there's enough pressure, I'm going to be like, okay. But as I can start to have boundaries, I'm actually going to feel a lot safer in my world because I feel like, no, I don't always have to say yes to things I don't want to. I can say my no's, I can set my boundaries, and we're actually going to feel more protected and safe, less anxious, less afraid on a regular basis, just because we show up for ourselves in that manner. So this is going to be really, really important work to be doing. And hopefully this gives you a lot of insight into where you're at with codependency right now. So what I'm going to do just to sort of close out today, obviously this is a huge topic. There's like literally so much more to cover. If you find yourself like wanting to work through these things, try to notice like what questions you answered yes to. And if you look at the actual codependency course, the codependency takes you through a whole bunch of steps for reprogramming. It's like our actual 7 steps to healing codependency. And I'll list at a high level what the steps are. But what you can do is take those pieces you found from your questionnaire. Like if you were like, yes, I do say yes to people when I want to say no, and plug into the major steps what work you need to do to heal, right? So if I say yes to people and I want to say no, that's a boundary step, right? That's me being able to work on my boundaries. So our 7 steps, and I'll go through them at a high level. Step 1 is to overcome our denial and lack of conscious awareness, which hopefully we've already done today through a deep understanding of codependency and the patterns and where they come from. It's so important to not shame yourself. If you're a codependent, I've been a codependent. It's normal that when we go through trauma to have codependent patterns that arise. And the opposite of where we want to go with this is to shame ourselves. We want to love ourselves and show up for ourselves and give ourselves what we didn't get to have in healthy ways in our childhood. Shaming just goes totally against the grain and in the opposite direction of what we want. So we want to overcome our lack of conscious awareness. I think we've done probably a lot of that from especially knowing exactly where we're at here. And step 2, and this is a great question to ask yourself, and the course has a lot of detail on this question, but to look at the long-term cost of staying codependent. It usually puts us right into action for wanting to create change, because when we look at what codependency has actually cost us, we look at the times when we said no, when we said yes to things and we meant no, and how that didn't feel good. We look at the resentment and what it felt like to carry that many times over. We look at like what it feels like to feel unseen because we're meeting someone else's needs and trying so hard to figure them out, and we're not even making any space for ourselves, or when we felt unheard or like we didn't matter. I don't matter is a big part of codependency too, as a core wound. I don't think I mentioned that. But we're not making our sense of self matter. So how could it feel like it matters to someone else when they can't truly know what that is without us first understanding it ourselves and then expressing it? The times that we had anger or frustration, or the times we betrayed or abandoned ourselves to try to gain approval, or we denied ourselves to people please, right? And then felt small, or the times we stayed in unhappy situations for far too long, right? All these different dynamics are like some of the costs of people pleasing. When we felt like we were taken advantage of because maybe somebody was advantageous, but we also didn't really set a boundary or say anything, all these things like, oh, like pain, suffering. So when we see and we start to see, what, codependency, yes, once upon a time in childhood, it was a survival strategy, but I'm an adult now. Like, look at what this is costing and the heaviness of carrying these codependent patterns now and in the past, and what this looks like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if I don't make these changes. Step 2 will really motivate you to like want to create change and then want to do the next steps. And the reason we put that step early is because, like we talked about at the beginning of today, when we don't have that step early, we're up against like these ideas that we've adopted from childhood. Like, we have to be codependent to stay safe and to survive, because that might have been what we went through at one point. So we're up against that, right? We're going to have a lot of resistance to change here in this area. So that will be really important. Step 3, you can make a list of all the places. This is a beautiful step if you really sit with it. It's like one of my favorites. All the places you need to make amends to you. And really look at like sitting and noticing where I self-betrayed, where I abandoned, where I put up with things that actually weren't fair or okay with me, and me being able to actually sit with that, see myself, take my own feelings into consideration, my own needs into consideration, and give myself an apology and actually be like, you know what? I'm sorry that I abandoned myself there. I'm sorry that I betrayed myself there. I notice the pain that caused, and I really want to like make amends and try to see myself more often and understand myself and show up for myself more consistently. So sometimes you have to really sit with it to like get into the feels of it. But the more you feel about that and work on like self-forgiveness, there's a little self-forgiveness set of steps in the course as well. Beautiful step, one of my favorites. And you can admit like, hey, I haven't been showing up well in this area for myself. And my subconscious mind has been disempowering my decision-making process, right? My subconscious fears have been driving this pattern of behavior. And then step 4 is, and this is huge for codependence, it's such a beautiful step too, is to understand what makes a relationship healthy and create a vision for what you want a relationship to look like. I find wherever we're on autopilot in our lives, we're basically, you can think of like, wherever we're on autopilot, you're essentially just like resigned to whatever subconscious programs you picked up in childhood. So wherever we're not conscious and intentional and trying to move towards something, we're instead living by our past, right? So, if we don't have something we want to move towards, even if we do the work, it's like, okay, we do the work and then we don't really know what something's supposed to look like or what a healthy relationship should be. And we can really increase our chances of getting there by creating a vision. Like, what do we want? We want healthy communication, consistency. We want trust, honesty, boundaries. We want, and so you can go through the 7 areas of life and get really clear there. There's an exercise, obviously, for that in the course. And then step 5 is strengthening self-identity. It's like really paying attention to our needs, really paying attention to our desires, really learning to take ourselves into consideration, having like healthy habits for ourselves, having forms of self-connection through routines we set up, like meditation or journaling. Even if we have like a natural feeling of resistance to this stuff, because we may have been out of relationship to ourselves for so long and we may feel like we're a stranger to ourselves, it's worth warming up and getting to know yourself. It's worth going through the discomfort initially to get to the point where you feel like you enjoy your time alone. And I'm sure there's a bunch of people in here who've had this experience already. But I know a lot of APs over the years who have been like, no, I would never want to journal. I'd never want to spend time by myself. I'm not interested. And then, they start doing the work. And then like a few months later, they're like, I love my alone time. I'm craving I see yeah. And that's beautiful. That's so beautiful, because you're in this place where you like enjoy yourself. And like, then the external world can affect you in the same way, right? Because it's like, hey, Bob could be unavailable right now, or this person could do this thing. And if I sit with it and I'm not taking it personally, and if I show up for myself, I have like a lot of emotional immunity to pain. And it's not a recipe to never feel pain, because we're still humans and things will still happen, but it's sure going to help you stop feeling unnecessary pain or suffering, self-created pain or suffering. So really, really beautiful stuff. And so that's our step 5. And then step 6 is us going through boundaries in a lot of detail, understanding our emotional boundaries, our physical boundaries, our mental boundaries, our sexual boundaries, our material boundaries. And as we tie all of these things together, our last step is to create this like mission and vision for our own lives and how we want things to look and where we want things to go, and how we want to show up for ourselves, and really creating some routines out of that. So we've got this like healthy sense of self, and we can still give and love and share with others. And ultimately, we're not looking for the opposite of codependency. We're not looking for hyper independence and it's only about myself and the relationship to myself. We're looking to be masters at both. Masters at giving, understanding, listening, loving, and masters at receiving, showing up for ourselves, showing up in the relationship to ourselves, understanding ourselves, self-soothing. And we're looking to, they're not ever going to be mutually exclusive things. It's the mastery of both sides that helps you to really get to a point where you can achieve full and wholehearted, healthy interdependence. And that's ultimately what we're looking to get to. So again, if you want to do like the 7 steps and do a deeper dive into all that, I highly suggest going through the course and the workbook and all the exercises, focusing on the steps that you need most. And I hope that makes a whole lot of sense. I can't answer any questions today. I'm so sorry. I have a meeting right after this that I have to jump off to. But I will keep a lookout for you guys. Dear Unicorn Avoider, Cynthia and Jane. I think I saw Narosha earlier too. I'll keep an eye out for you guys tomorrow in the Q&A session. Thank you all so much for being here, for participating, for sharing all of these questions. I think Ram is here already.
Yes.
Hi. Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna let Ram take over. Thank you guys so much for vulnerability sharing, all your amazing questions and support of one another. And I will see you guys tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern.